September 19th, 1944 dawned grey and cold across the rolling hills of Lorraine, where morning fog clung to the earth like a burial shroud. Staff Sergeant Kenneth Lamison sat inside his Sherman tank, hands steady on the controls, despite the weight of knowledge pressing down on every American tanker in the European theatre. His 75mm gun, the Army had assured them, could handle anything the Germans fielded. That reassurance had died in the Norman hedgerows when Panthers and Tigers turned American armor into funeral pyres with contemptuous ease. The Germans had given American tanks a nickname that cut deeper than any shell, Tommy Cookers, later Americanized to Ronsons after the cigarette lighter, whose slogan promised lights first time, every time. But this morning, near the village of Arracourt, something was about to change in the brutal mathematics of armored warfare. Hidden in the fog, German Panther tanks were advancing with the confidence of predators who had dominated the battlefield for over a year. Their commanders had every reason for that confidence. The Panther's long 75mm gun could destroy a Sherman from 2,000 meters, while the Sherman's stubby gun struggled to penetrate Panther armor, even at point-blank range. Oberst Friedrich Hartmann commanded elements of the newly formed 111th Panzer Brigade, and he approached the American positions with the assurance born of technical superiority. According to German tactical doctrine preserved in Wehrmacht training manuals, American armor represented a numerical threat only. Quality belonged exclusively to German steel. The Panther's sloped frontal armor, 80 millimeters thick at 55 degrees, created an effective thickness of 140 millimeters that standard American ammunition simply could not defeat. Wehrmacht propaganda broadcasts mocked American tanks as cardboard boxes on tracks, machines that prioritized production speed over combat effectiveness. Captured German documents from this period, now preserved in the National Archives, reveal that Panzer commanders genuinely believed American industrial doctrine had sacrificed quality for quantity to a fatal degree. They expected to destroy American tanks with the same methodical efficiency they had demonstrated since the Panther's introduction at Kursk in 1943. But what German intelligence had failed to adequately report and what Oberst Hartmann's forces were about to discover in the most violent way possible was that American armor doctrine was evolving with desperate urgency. The Sherman tanks, advancing through the Lorraine fog, weren't all armed with the inadequate 75mm gun. Some mounted a new 76mm high-velocity weapon, and, more importantly, a handful carried ammunition that would transform the tactical calculus of tank combat in a single devastating morning. The Battle of Arracourt would become one of the largest armored engagements on the Western Front, and its outcome would shatter German confidence in their technological superiority, while validating American tankers who had endured months of fighting with equipment they knew was inadequate. This is the story of how primitive American tanks, as German commanders dismissively called them, destroyed 88 German Panthers, Panzerfaustforts, and assault guns in 11 days of brutal combat. It's the story of tungsten-cored ammunition that arrived too late for thousands of American tankers, but just in time to prove that American industry could match German quality when properly motivated. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what happened at Arracourt, you must first understand the crisis of confidence that gripped American armored forces by late summer 1944. The Sherman tank had entered combat in North Africa during 1942 as arguably the best medium tank in the world. Its 75mm gun could penetrate any German tank it encountered. Its armor protected against existing anti-tank weapons, and its mechanical reliability outclassed temperamental German designs. British tank crews in the desert called it brilliant, praising its reliability and crew survivability compared to their own tanks. But warfare evolved with terrifying speed, and by mid-1943, the Sherman faced opponents it was never designed to fight. The German Panther medium tank appeared at Kursk in July 1943 with armor and firepower that made it nearly invulnerable to frontal attack from Allied tanks. The Tiger heavy tank, already in service, mounted the legendary 88mm gun that could destroy Shermans from ranges exceeding a mile. Against these opponents, American tank crews discovered their machines were dangerously outmatched. The statistics told a grim story. According to Army Ground Forces analysis compiled in 1944, now available through military archives, a Sherman 75mm gun using standard armor-piercing ammunition could penetrate approximately 3.5 inches of armor at 1,000 yards. The Panther's frontal glacis plate presented an effective thickness of 5.5 inches, making frontal penetration mathematically impossible at combat ranges. The math was even worse against Tigers, whose 100mm frontal armor at vertical angles created a nearly impenetrable barrier. American tank crews developed tactics to compensate for this disparity, tactics written in blood across the battlefields of France. Standard doctrine for a 5-tank platoon engaging German heavy armor required one section to draw enemy fire, while another maneuvered to strike the German tanks from the side or rear, where thinner armor offered vulnerability. The tactic worked sometimes, but at catastrophic cost. Men volunteering to be bait rarely survived the experience. Sergeant Robert Early of the 3rd Armored Division described the psychological burden in interviews preserved decades later by the Veterans History Project. You knew, going into every engagement, that your tank couldn't hurt them frontally, but theirs could punch through you like you were made of cardboard. Every time you saw a Tiger or Panther, your first thought wasn't how to kill it. It was how many of your friends were about to die trying. The Ordnance Department had recognized the problem earlier than field commanders appreciated. Development of a 76mm gun began in July 1942, almost immediately after the Sherman entered service. The new weapon used the same ammunition as the 3-inch gun mounted on M10 tank destroyers, promising significantly improved armor penetration. On paper, the 76mm firing standard armor-piercing ammunition could penetrate 4.3 inches of armor at 1,000 meters, enough to threaten Panther turret mantlets and Tiger frontal plates at combat ranges. But organizational inertia and doctrinal debates delayed the 76mm Sherman's deployment. Tank commanders, particularly those in General Patton's 3rd Army, initially rejected the improved weapon. Their reasoning reflected how thoroughly the Sherman's infantry support role had been emphasized in training. The 76mm high explosive shell contained only 0.86 pounds of TNT, compared to 1.47 pounds in the 75mm shell. For tank crews spending 80% of their ammunition engaging infantry and fortifications rather than other tanks, the reduced explosive power seemed like an unacceptable trade-off. Major General Hugh Gaffey of the 2nd Armored Division voiced the prevailing attitude in April 1944, meetings preserved in Army records. There were too few 76mm tanks available, troops weren't properly trained on the new gun, and logistics would become complicated, supplying different ammunition types. His recommendation was to delay 76mm deployment and keep formations standardized on the proven 75mm, not one 76mm. Sherman landed in France during the D-Day invasion in June 1944. American tank crews went ashore with the same guns that had proven inadequate against German heavy armor in Italy and Tunisia. It was a decision that would cost thousands of lives over the coming months. The Norman hedgerow country revealed the fatal consequences of this choice. Panther tanks appeared in significant numbers defending the bocage, and American armor losses skyrocketed. The close terrain favored defenders, and German tanks positioned behind earthen embankments transformed every hedge intersection into a potential death trap. Shermans burned with horrifying regularity, and casualty rates among tank crews climbed to levels that shocked even veteran commanders. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, learned of the crisis with anger and disbelief. According to General Omar Bradley's post-war memoirs published in 1951, Eisenhower confronted Ordnance Department officials with barely controlled fury. You mean our 76mm won't knock these Panthers out? Why, I thought it was going to be the wonder gun of the war. Why is it that I'm always the last to hear about this stuff? Ordnance told me this 76mm would take care of anything the Germans had. Now I find you can't knock out a damn thing with it yet. The problem wasn't actually the 76mm gun itself, but the ammunition it fired. Standard M62 armor-piercing capped rounds simply lacked the velocity needed to defeat sloped armor at the angles German tanks presented. The shell's design, optimized for penetrating vertical armor, struggled against the Panther's steeply angled glacis. Even direct hits at close range often bounced off harmlessly, leaving American crews to watch in horror as their best shots failed, while German return fire ended the engagement decisively. But American metallurgists and ordnance engineers had been working on a solution, one that would transform the 76mm from inadequate to lethal. The M93 high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition, designated T4 during development, represented a fundamental breakthrough in anti-tank projectile design. Instead of a solid steel projectile, the HVAP round used a lightweight aluminum body surrounding a dense tungsten carbide core. The physics were elegant and devastating. The lightweight outer body achieved much higher muzzle velocity, over 3,400 feet per second, compared to 2,600 feet per second for standard ammunition. Upon impact, the aluminum sabot separated, and the tungsten core, with its extreme density and hardness, punched through armor that stopped conventional rounds. Penetration tests at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland documented the HVAP's capabilities with clinical precision. At 1,000 meters, standard 76mm armor-piercing rounds penetrated 4.3 inches of armor. HVAP rounds, at the same range, penetrated 7 inches. That difference meant everything. 7 inches of penetration at 1,000 meters was enough to defeat the Panther's turret mantlet and the Tiger's frontal armor at ranges where German tankers had grown accustomed to operating with impunity. The first 2,000 rounds of 76mm HVAP ammunition arrived in France by air in August 1944, rushed forward with desperate urgency as the scale of American armor's disadvantage became undeniable. 20,000 more rounds were ordered, but production bottlenecks centered on tungsten. Availability meant supply never matched demand. Tungsten, critical for both armor-piercing ammunition and machine tools, was in chronically short supply. Priority allocation went to various weapon systems, and HVAP production competed with other critical needs. By February 1945, according to Army supply records, the average 76mm Sherman had received a total of 40 HVAP rounds, an acquisition rate of approximately 1 round per month. Tank crews hoarded HVAP ammunition like gold, using it only when absolutely necessary against heavy German armor. The scarcity created a perverse situation where American tanks finally had ammunition capable of defeating Panthers and Tigers frontally, but rarely had enough rounds to make a difference in sustained engagements. Captain Jimmy Leach commanded B Company of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, and in September 1944, his unit possessed something precious, a handful of his Shermans mounted 76mm guns, and his company had received a small allocation of HVAP ammunition, not enough to make his tankers confident, but enough to give them hope that they might survive an encounter with German heavy armor. The 4th Armored Division, part of General Patton's Third Army, had been racing across France since the breakout from Normandy in late July. By September, they had advanced hundreds of miles, their speed and aggression earning them a reputation as one of the most effective armored formations in the European theater. But that rapid advance had outrun supply lines, and by mid-September, the division sat near the Moselle River in Lorraine, consolidating positions while waiting for fuel and ammunition to catch up. German High Command saw opportunity in the American pause. The 5th Panzer Army, under General Hasso von Manteuffel, had been hastily assembled to counterattack the American penetration. The force included the newly formed 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades, equipped with the latest Panther tanks fresh from German factories. On paper, the force looked formidable. 262 tanks and assault guns, including over 90 Panthers. But appearances deceived. The Panzer brigades were newly formed units whose crews had barely trained together. Many tankers were replacements rushed from training schools to replace catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front. The Panthers themselves, while technically superior to Shermans, suffered from mechanical issues that plagued rushed production. Transmissions failed with alarming regularity, engines overheated, and final drives broke under the stress of the tank's enormous weight. Still, German commanders approached the operation with confidence. They outnumbered the American armor in the Arracourt sector, they held technical superiority in tanks, and they believed American tankers would react with the same defensive caution that characterized most Allied armored operations. They were about to discover how wrong those assumptions were. September 18th marked the opening of the German counteroffensive when elements of the 111th Panzer Brigade struck at American positions near Luneville. The initial attack achieved surprise, and German tanks penetrated American outposts, destroying 24 Allied vehicles in sharp fighting. But American resistance stiffened quickly, and the attack stalled. General von Manteuffel, recognizing his forces couldn't take Luneville through frontal assault, ordered a shift north toward Arracourt, where American defenses looked thinner. The morning of September 19th brought thick fog that reduced visibility to less than 100 meters. German tank commanders trained on the Eastern Front, where long-range gunnery was standard doctrine, found themselves advancing blind into terrain they didn't fully understand. The fog negated their range advantage, forcing engagements at distances where American tanks could fight on more equal terms. It was exactly the weather American tankers needed. Staff Sergeant Lamison's C Company, 37th Tank Battalion, occupied positions on a ridge overlooking the approaches to Arracourt. His crew had been awake since before dawn, watching the fog and listening to radio reports of German armor moving north from Luneville. Intelligence estimated at least company-strength enemy forces, probably Panthers, approaching their position. Lamison checked his ammunition load again, mostly standard armor-piercing shells, a few high-explosive rounds, and 3 precious HVAP rounds locked in the ready rack. 3 chances to kill a German heavy tank if they appeared at the wrong angle or the wrong range. At approximately 0800 hours, shapes materialized in the fog. 8 Panther tanks, advancing in a loose formation, appeared less than 400 meters from Lamison's position. The German crews, struggling to navigate through limited visibility, had no idea American tanks occupied the ridge ahead. Their attention focused forward, searching for threats, while Lamison's company held perfect hull-down positions with only their turrets exposed. Lamison's gunner, Corporal James Rothwell, acquired the lead Panther in his sight. The range was close enough that even standard ammunition might penetrate the Panther's side armor if they caught it at the right angle. But Lamison wasn't taking chances. "Load at HVAP," he ordered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. The 76mm gun elevated slightly, compensating for the downward angle from the ridge. Rothwell centered the Panther in his sight, leading it slightly to account for its movement. The electrical traverse system whirred softly as he made final adjustments. "Fire when ready," Lamison said. The gun recoiled with a sharp crack, and the tungsten cord projectile crossed the 400 meters to target in less than half a second. The HVAP round struck the lead Panther's turret side, and the penetration was catastrophic. The tungsten core punched through the armor like paper, and secondary explosions rippled through the German tank as ammunition detonated. Flames erupted from every hatch, and the Panther shuddered to a halt, transformed from predator to funeral pyre in the space of 3 seconds. The other 7 Panthers responded with professional speed, their commanders recognizing they were under fire and attempting to locate the threat. But the fog and ridge position made American tanks nearly impossible to spot, while the German tanks stood exposed on the forward slope. Lamison's company opened fire with every gun, and the ridge lit up with muzzle flashes as Shermans engaged the closest range most crews had ever experienced against Panther tanks. 2 more Panthers died in the first 30 seconds, both hit by HVAP rounds that penetrated turret armor with devastating effect. The remaining German tanks attempted to return fire, but shooting at muzzle flashes in fog against hull-down targets proved impossible. Within 2 minutes, 4 Panthers burned on the slope, and the surviving tanks reversed frantically, seeking cover in the fog that had become their shield rather than advantage. Lamison stood in his turret, watching the Panthers withdraw and trying to process what had just happened. His company had engaged 8 Panthers at close range and destroyed 4 without taking a single casualty. The HVAP ammunition had worked exactly as promised, turning encounters that should have been death sentences into survivable, even winnable fights. He had started the engagement with 3 HVAP rounds and finished with none, but 4 dead Panthers seemed like fair trade. The engagement set the pattern for the Battle of Arracourt. Over the next 11 days, American tank companies would repeatedly catch German armor at disadvantageous ranges and angles, using superior tactical deployment and the new HVAP ammunition to destroy Panthers that German commanders considered invulnerable. The fog that morning had been an accident of weather, but American commanders quickly recognized its value and adapted their tactics to maximize close-range engagements where the Sherman's mechanical reliability and crew training could offset the Panthers' technical advantages. But the HVAP ammunition remained in desperately short supply, and not every American tank company had access to the Wonder rounds. Most engagements still required traditional flanking maneuvers and acceptance of disproportionate losses. The Battle of Arracourt would ultimately be won through a combination of factors: superior American reconnaissance, devastating air support from P-47 Thunderbolts, better tactical coordination, and the ability to rapidly replace and repair damaged tanks. But HVAP ammunition, when available, transformed specific engagements from desperate struggles into decisive victories. German after-action reports from the 111th Panzer Brigade, captured after the war and now available in the Bundesarchiv military archives, reveal the psychological impact of these encounters. Tank commanders reported American shells penetrating Panther armor at ranges they had considered safe. One report noted with confusion that American tanks were destroying Panthers with single shots rather than requiring multiple hits to mission-kill German armor. The reports lacked understanding of what had changed. German intelligence had not yet identified HVAP ammunition as a significant threat. Oberst Hartmann survived the initial engagements, but his brigade had been savaged. 24 Panthers destroyed or disabled in the first 3 days of combat, losses that could not be replaced. His crews, already inexperienced, became cautious to the point of paralysis. The aggressive tactics that characterized Panzer doctrine gave way to defensive positioning and reluctance to engage, unless circumstances heavily favored German forces. The transformation in American tank crew morale was equally dramatic. Men who had approached every engagement with grim fatalism, knowing their tanks were outmatched, suddenly fought with aggressive confidence when they possessed HVAP ammunition. The psychological burden of fighting with inferior equipment had been, if not eliminated, at least substantially reduced. Tank commanders began taking risks they had previously avoided, knowing they had ammunition that could defeat German armor when opportunities presented themselves. Staff Sergeant Chuck Miller, a Sherman commander in Baker Company, described the shift in later interviews. For months we had been the hunted. Every time we saw a panther or tiger, our first instinct was to hide or run. But at Arracourt, we became hunters. Not all of us, not all the time. We didn't have enough HVAP for that, but enough that we stopped thinking of ourselves as victims waiting to burn. We started thinking about how to kill the bastards, and that changed everything. The battle continued through September with a series of engagements that tested both American and German forces to their limits. German commanders committed their armor piecemeal, unable to coordinate large-scale attacks due to poor reconnaissance and communication problems. American forces, benefiting from excellent intelligence provided by the 9th Reconnaissance Squadron and other units, always seemed to know where German attacks would develop. This allowed them to position forces advantageously and call in artillery and air support before German armor could concentrate effectively. On September 20th, German forces attempted to seize Hill 318, a tactically important height that dominated the surrounding terrain. The attack began before dawn, with Panthers and Panzer IVs advancing under cover of morning fog, American defenders dug in on the reverse slope, waited until German tanks crested the Côte hill before opening fire at point-blank range. The engagement lasted less than an hour and cost the Germans 23 tanks destroyed. German tank crews began reporting phenomena they had never experienced before. American tanks that should have been easy kills somehow survived hits and continued fighting. What they didn't realize was that late production Shermans featured wet ammunition storage, where glycerin-filled jackets surrounded ammunition racks. The wet stowage dramatically reduced the likelihood of catastrophic ammunition fires when tanks were penetrated. Combined with improved crew escape hatches and better training in emergency evacuation procedures, the modifications meant Sherman crews were surviving hits that would have killed them a year earlier. The casualty statistics told a complicated story. The 4th Armored Division lost 21 Shermans, totally destroyed, during the main phase of the Battle of Arracourt from September 18th through 29th. Another 25 were damaged but recovered and repaired. Against this, German forces lost 88 tanks and assault guns, totally destroyed, with many more damaged. The exchange ratio, approximately 4-1, in favor of American forces, represented a complete reversal of earlier tank battles, where German armor had routinely achieved favorable kill ratios against Allied tanks. What explained this transformation? Historians analyzing the battle have identified multiple contributing factors. American reconnaissance provided early warning of German movements, allowing defensive positions to be prepared. Air support from the 99th Tactical Air Command flew hundreds of sorties, attacking German armor and supply columns whenever weather permitted. American artillery, called in with devastating accuracy by forward observers, disrupted German formations before they could concentrate. Tank destroyer battalions, particularly the 704th equipped with M18 Hellcats, provided mobile anti-tank capability that engaged German armor from advantageous positions. But underlying all these factors was a fundamental shift in the material balance. The arrival of 76mm Shermans armed with HVAP ammunition meant American tankers could, for the first time since facing Panthers and Tigers, engage German heavy armor with reasonable confidence of achieving penetration. The rounds remained scarce, but their existence changed the psychological dynamic of armored combat in ways that extended far beyond their actual use. Captain Kenneth Lamison, reflecting decades later on the battle, emphasized this point. The HVAP rounds saved my life at Arracourt, but more than that, they saved my sanity. For months, I had been ordering men into combat, knowing their equipment was inadequate, knowing I was sending them to die in tanks that couldn't protect them properly. The HVAP ammunition didn't solve everything. We still needed better armor, better guns, better everything. But it gave us a fighting chance, and that was more than we had before. The German 5th Panzer Army's counteroffensive collapsed by the end of September. The 2 panzer brigades that had attacked with such confidence lay shattered, their tank strength depleted beyond effective combat capability. Personnel casualties exceeded 700 killed and 300 wounded, losses the Wehrmacht could ill afford. More significantly, the failure demonstrated that German qualitative superiority in armor could no longer overcome Allied advantages in numbers, logistics, air support, and increasingly, training and tactics. The lessons of Arracourt spread through American armored units with the speed of wildfire through dry timber. Word passed from crew to crew that the new 76mm Sherman, when armed with HVAP ammunition, could kill Panthers frontally. Tank companies that had resisted transitioning from the familiar 75mm suddenly demanded the improved weapon. By January 1945, the 12th Army Group formally requested that all future Sherman deliveries to Europe be 76mm versions, refusing to accept any additional 75mm tanks. The shift in doctrine reflected hard-won experience written in burning German armor across the battlefields of France. But the supply of HVAP ammunition remained the critical bottleneck that prevented the 76mm Sherman from achieving its full potential. Total production, through March 1945, reached only 18,000 rounds for the 76mm gun, with 42% allocated to tank units and the remainder going to 3-inch guns on M10 tank destroyers. To put that number in perspective, a single tank battalion with 54 tanks, each carrying 71 main gun rounds, possessed over 3,800 rounds of total ammunition. 18,000 HVAP rounds for the entire European theatre meant individual tanks received, on average, 5 rounds across months of combat. Tank commanders developed strict rules for HVAP use. Fire only when engaging confirmed heavy armor at ranges exceeding 600 meters where standard ammunition proved ineffective, and never waste HVAP on lighter targets like Panzer IV that standard rounds could defeat. The psychology of scarcity created its own problems. Tank crews hoarded HVAP ammunition, sometimes holding fire in situations where the wonder rounds would have been decisive because they feared running out completely. After-action reports from late 1944 document instances where crews declined to engage Panthers at favorable ranges with HVAP, saving the precious ammunition for emergencies that never materialized before the tanks were destroyed by other threats. But when used properly, HVAP ammunition transformed tactical calculations in ways that affected its entire operations. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's desperate December offensive through the Ardennes, would demonstrate both the value and the tragic scarcity of effective anti-tank ammunition. German forces committed over 400 Panthers and 180 Tigers to the offensive, betting that their qualitative superiority in armor would overcome American numerical advantages in the difficult Ardennes terrain. The gamble failed for multiple reasons, but the performance of American armor played a significant role. By December 1944, approximately 25% of American tanks in Europe mounted 76mm guns, and while HVAP ammunition remained scarce, enough existed to make German tank commanders cautious. The aggressive tactics that characterized earlier German armored operations gave way to more conservative approaches as panzer crews learned that American tanks could now fight back effectively at ranges previously considered safe. Sergeant Francis Baker commanded a 76mm Sherman during the November fighting leading up to the Bulge. His experience, documented in official reports preserved at the National Archives, illustrated both the potential and limitations of the 76mm gun with standard ammunition. On November 20th, 1944, Baker's company engaged German Panther tanks at approximately 800 yards range. He ordered his gunner to fire at the closest Panther, hitting it squarely in the side, the most vulnerable aspect of the heavily armored German tank. To my amazement and disgust, Baker later wrote, I watched the shell bounce off the side. My gunner fired at least 6 more rounds at the vehicle, hitting it from turret to track. This German tank, knowing that it possibly would be supported by a tank destroyer, started to pull away. I was completely surprised to see it moving after receiving 7 hits from my gun. Baker's frustration highlighted the continuing problem with standard 76mm ammunition against German armor. Even side shots against Panthers could fail to penetrate if the angle wasn't optimal or the range was too great. But his report noted significantly that his company had no HVAP ammunition available at the time. Had he possessed even 2 or 3 HVAP rounds, the engagement would likely have ended with a destroyed Panther rather than a frustrated American tanker watching his target escape after absorbing 7 hits. The contrast with engagements where HVAP was available proved dramatic. Lieutenant John Stevenson's tank platoon encountered 2 Panthers near Bastogne during the relief operation in late December. Armed with HVAP ammunition, Stevenson's lead tank engaged at 900 meters, an almost unthinkable range for Shermans to successfully engage Panthers. The HVAP round struck the Panther's turret mantlet, penetrated, and the German tank erupted in flames as ammunition cooked off. The second Panther, witnessing the destruction of its platoon mate, immediately reversed into cover and withdrew from the engagement. German tank commanders interviewed after the war consistently cited the appearance of American tanks capable of frontal penetration as a significant psychological factor affecting their tactics. Hans von Luck, who commanded panzer units during the Ardennes offensive and later wrote the memoir Panzer Commander, noted that by late 1944 his crews had lost the confidence that characterized earlier operations. We had been told our armor was superior, von Luck wrote. But increasingly, we encountered American tanks that could destroy our Panthers from ranges we had considered safe. The technical advantage we held in 1943 had eroded by late 1944, and our crews knew it. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The tactical adaptation by German forces revealed how profoundly HVAP ammunition, despite its limited availability, had altered the dynamics of armored warfare. Panzer doctrine had emphasized aggressive maneuver and concentration of force, using the Panther's superior range and protection to destroy enemy armor before closing two ranges where they faced effective return fire. But by early 1945, German tank commanders were adopting defensive tactics that emphasized prepared positions, ambush from concealment, and withdrawal when faced with determined American attack. This defensive shift had strategic implications beyond individual tank battles. German armor, stripped of its offensive capability by fuel shortages and the need to husband strength against American firepower, could no longer conduct the deep penetrations and encirclements that characterized blitzkrieg warfare. The Wehrmacht's armored forces, once the spearhead of German military power, had been reduced to essentially mobile pillboxes, strong in defense but incapable of the offensive operations that might have changed the war's trajectory. American industrial response to the HVAP shortage illustrated both the strengths and weaknesses of wartime production. Once the tungsten supply problem was recognized as critical, efforts were made to increase production, but tungsten remained chronically scarce, used in everything from armor-piercing ammunition to machine tools for manufacturing aircraft engines and tank components. Priority allocation became a zero-sum game, where increasing HVAP production meant reducing availability for other critical applications. The Ordnance Department explored alternative solutions. Development of improved armor-piercing ammunition continued, with metallurgists testing different alloy compositions that might achieve better penetration without requiring scarce materials. The M93 HVAP represented the best available solution given material constraints, but it wasn't the best theoretically possible solution. British engineers, working with less constrained tungsten supplies, had developed APS discarding sabot ammunition for their 17-pounder gun that achieved even higher velocities and better penetration than American HVAP. Technical comparisons between Allied anti-tank weapons revealed interesting patterns. The British 17-pounder, mounting essentially the same 76.2mm caliber as the American 76mm gun, achieved significantly better performance through more aggressive propellant loading and longer barrel length. The 17-pounder firing APDS ammunition could penetrate German heavy tank armor reliably at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. American 76mm guns, shortened to fit Sherman turrets and limited by concerns about barrel wear, achieved roughly half that effective range, even with HVAP. The question haunted American armored commanders even as Germany collapsed toward defeat. If HVAP had been available in quantity 6 months earlier, how many lives would have been saved? How many tank crews who died in the Norman hedgerows might have survived to see victory? Staff Sergeant Miller, who fought through the entire campaign from Normandy to Germany, addressed the question in his characteristic, understated way. The HVAP was a good round. We needed it earlier, and we needed more of it. How many guys died because we didn't have it? I don't know, but it was too many. The statistical analysis, compiled by Army historians in the years after the war, attempted to quantify the impact. The 3rd Armored Division, one of the first American armored divisions committed to combat in Normandy, suffered tank losses that told a sobering story. Between June and September 1944, the division lost over 600 Shermans to enemy action. Many of these losses occurred in engagements where HVAP ammunition would have allowed successful frontal engagement of German armor, rather than requiring flanking maneuvers that exposed American tanks to defensive fire. Casualty rates among tank crews during this period reached levels that shocked even commanders accustomed to the brutal arithmetic of modern warfare. Some companies experienced complete crew turnover multiple times during the 4 months of combat, with replacement crews rushed to the front with minimal training. The human cost of fighting with inadequate equipment extended beyond immediate casualties to encompass the psychological toll on survivors who watched friends burn in tanks that couldn't adequately protect them. The appearance of the M26 Pershing heavy tank in February 1945, with its 90mm gun capable of defeating any German armor at combat ranges, rendered many of these debates moot for the final months of war. But the Pershing's late arrival and limited production, only 20 saw combat in Europe before Germany's surrender, meant the vast majority of American tankers finished the war in Shermans. For these crews, HVAP ammunition remained the only effective means of frontally engaging German heavy armor. The final months of the European war saw German armor becoming increasingly scarce as fuel shortages, lack of replacement vehicles, and the grinding attrition of Allied air attacks devastated panzer formations. By March 1945, American tank companies sometimes went weeks without encountering German armor. When engagements did occur, they typically involved small numbers of German tanks operating defensively from prepared positions rather than the large-scale armored battles that characterized earlier fighting. This scarcity of targets created a perverse situation where HVAP ammunition, finally becoming more available as production ramped up, had fewer opportunities for employment. Some tank crews finished the war with HVAP rounds they never fired, the ammunition arriving too late to matter. The irony was not lost on veterans who had desperately needed such ammunition during the desperate fighting of summer and fall 1944. The legacy of the HVAP shortage extended well into the post-war period, shaping American tank development and ammunition procurement for decades. The Korean War, beginning in June 1950, saw American M4A3E-8 Shermans, the late production models with 76mm guns and improved suspension, facing Soviet-supplied T-34-85 tanks. But unlike in World War II, HVAP ammunition was amply supplied, and American tank crews had little difficulty penetrating T-34 armor at combat ranges. The contrast was striking. In Korea, American tankers possessed both capable equipment and adequate ammunition from the start of hostilities. The lessons learned at such terrible cost in Europe had been internalized, and procurement decisions reflected the understanding that technological parity or superiority required both capable weapons and effective ammunition in sufficient quantities. Korean War veterans noted the difference immediately. "We had everything we needed to do the job," one Sherman commander recalled. "Good tanks, good ammunition, good training. It was night and day compared to what the guys in Europe dealt with in '44. The technical evolution of American armor-piercing ammunition continued through the Cold War, with increasingly sophisticated designs achieving ever higher penetration. But the fundamental lessons of World War II remained constant. Superior ammunition could transform an adequate tank into an effective one, while even the best tank became vulnerable when armed with inadequate ammunition. The 76mm Sherman, armed with HVAP, represented that truth perfectly. A competent tank that could fight and win when given the tools to do so, but which struggled desperately when those tools were unavailable. German perspectives on American armor evolution revealed grudging respect mixed with continued confusion about American procurement decisions. Captured German tank commanders, interviewed during the war's final weeks, expressed surprise that Americans had possessed heavy tank capability but delayed its widespread deployment. Many assumed the Pershing had existed earlier but was held in reserve, unable to comprehend that procurement and doctrinal debates had delayed its fielding. Similarly, German intelligence struggled to understand HVAP ammunition's limited availability, assuming that any capable military would have prioritized such obviously effective munitions? The answer lay in the complexities of wartime industrial mobilization and the challenges of balancing competing priorities. Tungsten scarcity was real and affected multiple weapons systems. The decision to shorten the 76mm gun barrel to fit Sherman turrets, while necessary for production, reduced the gun's effectiveness and made HVAP more critical to achieve adequate performance. These decisions, made under pressure with imperfect information, created cascading effects that lasted throughout the war. Oberst Friedrich Hartmann, interviewed by British military historians researching the Battle of Arracourt in 1972, spoke with the candor of a professional soldier assessing a worthy opponent. "We underestimated them," Hartmann admitted. "We thought our Panthers were invincible, that American tanks would break against our guns like waves against rocks. But they never fought the way we expected. They were always moving, always coordinating, always finding our weak points. And by late 44, their tanks were better than we wanted to admit. They had ammunition that could hurt us, and they knew how to use it. In the end, it didn't matter that our tanks were technically better. They had more of them, and they used them better than we used ours." The human dimension of the HVAP story extended beyond tactical engagements and strategic implications to encompass the individual experiences of men who fought in Shermans throughout the European campaign. These tankers developed deep understanding of their machines' capabilities and limitations. They knew exactly which German tanks they could engage successfully with standard ammunition, which required HVAP, and which were better avoided entirely unless circumstances heavily favored American forces. Staff Sergeant Charles Bogus, who commanded a Sherman from Normandy through Germany, described the evolution in later interviews. "At first, seeing a Panther or Tiger meant you were probably about to die. You'd try to run, try to hide, try to get a shot at their side or rear because frontal shots just bounced off. But by Arracourt, by the Bulge, we had enough 76mm tanks with HVAP that we could sometimes fight them head-on. It didn't make us equal. We still needed tactics and coordination and usually numerical advantage. But it made us players in the game instead of just targets." The mythology that grew up around American armor in the decades after the war often obscured these nuances. Popular culture frequently portrayed the Sherman as either hopelessly inadequate or perfectly sufficient, missing the complex reality that its effectiveness varied dramatically based on ammunition availability, crew training, tactical employment, and the specific threats encountered. The 76mm Sherman with HVAP represented the tank at its best, capable of engaging any German armor with reasonable prospect of success when used skillfully. But that best version remained relatively rare throughout most of the European campaign. The statistical legacy of HVAP's limited availability appears in the records of destroyed and damaged tanks analyzed by military researchers after the war. Of approximately 11,000 total Sherman losses in Europe, thousands occurred in circumstances where HVAP ammunition would have provided effective defense or allowed successful prosecution of engagements that instead resulted in American casualties. The exact number remains impossible to determine. Different tactical situations, crew training levels, and terrain would have affected outcomes regardless of ammunition type. But informed estimates by armor historians suggest that adequate HVAP supply could have reduced American tank losses by 20 to 30% in heavy armor engagements. Translated to human terms, that reduction might have saved thousands of tank crewmen from death or injury. Each Sherman carried a 5-man crew: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver. Every tank destroyed represented 5 men killed, wounded, or at best terrified by the experience of bailing out of burning vehicles. The crews who survived multiple tank losses, and many did, carried psychological scars that lasted lifetimes. The knowledge that better ammunition existed but wasn't available added insult to injury. The final accounting of the 76mm Sherman's combat record showed remarkable effectiveness when properly employed and adequately supplied. In Korea, where HVAP was plentiful and enemy armor less formidable than German Panthers and Tigers, 76mm Shermans achieved kill ratios approaching 5-1 against T-34-85s. In World War II Europe, the same tanks achieved more modest but still respectable ratios, particularly in the war's final months when HVAP availability improved and German armor quality deteriorated due to material shortages. The psychological transformation HVAP created among American tank crews represented perhaps its most important legacy. Men who had fought for months, knowing their equipment was inadequate, suddenly gained tools that made them competitive. The change in attitude affected everything from tactical aggressiveness to crew retention to the advice veteran tankers gave to replacements. Instead of counseling desperate caution and fatalistic acceptance of losses, experienced crews could teach new tankers how to engage German armor successfully and survive the experience. Captain Jimmy Leach, whose B Company distinguished itself at Arracourt, summarized the transformation in his post-war account. The HVAP ammunition didn't make the Sherman a supertank. It remained vulnerable to German guns. It still lacked the armor to trade shots with Panthers on equal terms. But HVAP gave us options. Instead of always maneuvering for side shots, accepting casualties to get into position, we could sometimes engage frontally when the situation allowed. That flexibility saved lives and made us more effective. It's what we needed from the beginning. The controversy over why HVAP arrived in such limited quantities and so late persisted for decades, fueling debates among military historians and veterans organizations. Congressional investigations after the war examined procurement decisions and resource allocation, trying to understand whether the shortage represented unavoidable material constraints or institutional failure. The conclusions remained ambiguous. Tungsten scarcity was real, but priority allocation decisions could have shifted production toward HVAP earlier. The shortened 76mm gun barrel reduced effectiveness, but the decision to shorten it enabled faster production and turret integration. These debates ultimately mattered less to the veterans who had fought in Shermans than the simple recognition that they had done their duty despite inadequate equipment. The 76mm Sherman with HVAP represented what American armor could have been throughout the European campaign if procurement and industrial priorities had aligned differently. Instead, it represented what American armor became in the campaign's final months, capable and effective, but tragically late for the thousands of tankers who died before HVAP arrived. May 8, 1945, brought German surrender and the end of the European War. The Sherman tanks that had carried American armored forces from Normandy to the Elbe River sat silent in German towns and fields, their guns no longer needed. Many bore the scars of combat, welded patches covering battle damage, spare tracks bolted to hulls for additional protection, personal modifications that crews had made to increase their chances of survival. The 76mm Shermans, particularly those that had received HVAP ammunition, represented the evolution of American armor under pressure of combat necessity. Veterans returning home carried with them complex feelings about the machines they had fought in, pride in what they had accomplished, mixed with anger at having been sent into battle with equipment that was, for much of the campaign, inadequate for the threats they faced. The Sherman's reputation suffered from this experience, and popular understanding often portrayed it as inferior to German armor. That this wasn't quite true. The Sherman was a capable medium tank that performed well in its intended role, but it had been forced into a heavy tank's role without heavy tank characteristics, and men died because of that mismatch. The HVAP ammunition represented American industry's ability to respond to battlefield requirements with innovative solutions, but also highlighted the challenges of wartime production and resource allocation. The Wonder Rounds worked exactly as promised when available, transforming tactical situations and saving lives. But chronic scarcity meant many tank crews never benefited from the innovation that might have saved them. Staff Sergeant Kenneth Lamison, who destroyed 4 Panthers at Arracourt with HVAP ammunition, survived the war and returned to civilian life in Pennsylvania. He rarely spoke about his combat experience, but on the occasions when he did, he emphasized one point. The HVAP made us equals. That brief statement captured the essence of what the ammunition meant to American tankers. Not superiority, not overwhelming advantage, but simple equality. The ability to face German heavy armor without the crushing psychological burden of knowing your machine was outmatched before the first shot. The Sherman tank continued serving in American and Allied armies for decades after World War II. Seeing combat in the Korea, the Middle East, and numerous other conflicts, various nations upgraded it with more powerful guns, better armor, and improved systems, but the 76mm Sherman armed with HVAP remained historically significant as the version that finally allowed American medium tanks to engage German heavy armor on reasonably equal terms. It arrived late and in insufficient quantities, but when present it transformed battlefield mathematics from suicidal to survivable. The lessons learned from the HVAP experience shaped American military development for generations. The importance of ammunition quality, not just gun caliber, became central to tank design philosophy. The need for responsive procurement that could adapt to battlefield feedback drove reforms in Ordnance Department procedures. The recognition that even technically inferior equipment could achieve success with proper ammunition, training, and tactics influenced military education for decades. German tank commanders who faced 76mm Shermans armed with HVAP in the war's final months witnessed the erosion of advantages they had held for years. The Panther and Tiger, while still formidable, were no longer invincible. American tanks could hurt them, and American tankers had learned how to maximize their machines' capabilities. Combined with overwhelming Allied air superiority, artillery coordination, and numerical advantage, the improved anti-tank capability of late-war American armor contributed to the collapse of German defensive operations. The 76mm Sherman, armed with HVAP ammunition, stands as testament to both American industrial innovation and the human cost of delayed implementation. It proved that American engineers could solve the armor penetration problem when given priority and resources, but it also demonstrated that even good solutions arrive too late when organizational inertia and competing priorities delay fielding. The thousands of American tankers who died before HVAP became available paid the price for those delays. For the veterans who survived, the memory of fighting in Shermans remained vivid decades later. They remembered the fear that came with facing German heavy armor, the relief when HVAP ammunition finally arrived, and the anger that it hadn't come sooner. They remembered friends who died in burning tanks before effective ammunition became available, and they remembered that despite inadequate equipment, they had done their duty and won their war. The Sherman tank's reputation has undergone rehabilitation in recent decades, as historians have examined its actual combat record rather than relying on myths and post-war accounts. When properly employed with adequate ammunition, the Sherman performed capably against most threats. The 76mm version, armed with HVAP, represented American armor at its best, proof that when given the right tools, American tankers could fight and win against any opponent. The tragedy was that those tools came too late for too many men who deserve better. The story of HVAP ammunition and the 76mm Sherman ultimately transcends technical specifications and tactical analyses to reveal fundamental truths about modern warfare. Equipment quality matters, but so does ammunition, training, tactics, and the moral responsibility of leadership to provide soldiers with adequate tools. American tankers at Arracourt proved they could defeat technically superior German armor when given ammunition that worked. The question that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives was simple and unanswerable. Why did it take so long? Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.